G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now today I just wanted to sit down with you and have a talk about the Israeli offensive that we have seen launched into southern Lebanon and of course the entire situation there. We're going to look at it tactically, we're going to look at it strategically. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware, but if you're not, I served in the military, I served in the infantry, I served in Afghanistan. I also have spent many, many weeks in Israel, both in the south down near Gaza, in the north on the border with Lebanon, in particularly the areas of which these offensives have been launched across from. And what I look at mostly on my channel is I look at a lot of tactical and strategic warfare also, as there are tactical elements of this, there are strategic elements of this, some of which one side is winning, some of which the same side is losing. So we're going to talk about that at length. But what has inspired me to talk about this was I've had a couple of phone calls recently, one main one and then a chat with a guy. Both of these guys, ex-service members, incredibly experienced and vehemently pro-Israel. But they've said some very, very interesting things to me, and I'll show you throughout then the video, as well as I want to talk about asymmetrical guerrilla warfare and some historical examples from some reading material also that I'll show you, and I will show you the book this time. I know people want me to include a reading list every time I do a video. So let's get into it. So, of course, as you would be aware, Israel has launched its ground offensive into southern Lebanon, into, I don't know if I can say the word, I'm just going to, into Hezbollah-controlled territory. So right there, I just got demonetized. So if you want to support me, links down below. But into then Hezbollah-controlled territory. And this has followed a number of strikes that we saw, particularly the large ones in residential areas that targeted and dismantled the senior leadership of Hezbollah, as well as Israeli intelligence operations targeting communications equipment in an interesting at best, a terrorist attack at worst, due to the indiscriminate nature of these exploding devices. But we saw that carried out over the past few weeks as well. Let's touch on that, because this does raise some concerns and some very large questions also. Firstly, electronic devices being jeopardized in a kinetic form, not just being, then useless. Well, say for Australia, say for the majority of the world, where produces 99% of our electronic devices? Where produces that? Well, is the country that produces this the one of which we're told that likely will be at war with within the decade? Now, I'm not saying there's any there's any electronic devices jeopardized, but could we see that in the future? And does this really need to raise some questions about the concerns of the possibility of that happening as well? Secondly, around the efficiency of targeting these senior commanders, as well as these operations to secretly jeopardize pages and these devices we spoke of. Many, many people say the efficiency that you can pinpoint this guy sitting on the toilet and thousands of these devices. The questions then asked back, well, then how for months and months was Hamas able to prepare for the October 7th attacks completely unnoticed and take that by surprise in an incredibly intelligence-saturated area, both of imagery and informants on the ground? Now, let's get into something else. One thing I've seen as an observer of the social changes on and outlook on this war is, like I spoke right at the beginning, some of my friends who are vehemently pro-Israel and anti these organizations, these terror groups, these are former members of some very specialized units, and some of what they've told me, this raises concern also. So a very, very experienced guy, we just have a weekly phone catch-up. We're mates anyway. But he did say to me words of the effect of, yeah, well, that's just straight terrorism. I don't know how you can get away with that regarding those electronic devices. And that took me by shock. I had my AirPods in doing the bloody dishes at the time, and I was like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that from you. And yeah, knowing his background, it's like, I was very surprised hearing that. And I'll share a message here from another talking about the strikes against HVT's high-value targets. So not only do you have the hardcore supporters on either side of this, there's even on some supporters, people going, I still support that, but that is then questionable. So let's go on that strategic element just for a second, and I can do a video on this if you'd like. But this war has sped up the divide between the global south, particularly the coined term of the axis of upheaval, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That's been coined as the axis of upheaval by some intelligence groups around the world. And that division between the global south of that and then Western states. This is not only state-to-state division, but domestic division within these Western states. And if you don't believe me on this domestic division, do the little roller on your mouse and scroll down to the comments here, and my point will be proven. And this division in the Western states, this is absolutely in favour of China and Russia's unconventional warfare and how they see the world shifting soon from a more unipolar to a more multipolar world, and that shift happening. And this is part of the reason I don't believe that Russia or China really have a horse in the race, so to speak, in the US presidential election and election interference. I'm not saying that that isn't occurring, but it's not clear to me which side or the other they would be pushing. I think they most want, for their outlook, they want what will cause the most division. As well, you can see through some Russian intelligence operations, as well as just blatantly put out from the Kremlin, they talk of that they believe liberalism is killing, or neoliberalism, as I'll say, is killing Western states. But I think they just want this division. That's the goal there. It doesn't matter if it's left or right or up and down or black or white. Division is the goal. And this war, I believe, has sped that up a decade or more. So strategically, this will become more and more relevant into the future, but that is for another video down the track. So, of course, in these attacks in the past 24 hours, we have seen 8 Israeli commandos killed in an assault, with some reporting that that number is far higher. I'll show you at least the confirmation of the 8 by the IDF here. Now, as a former infantryman, and I've been in these areas in the north seeing then the terrain, the first thing that struck me is how difficult that terrain would be to fight in. It's mountainous, it's steep, it's shaly rock. And this territory, this terrain, increases the enemy's chances there, if you're going into that terrain, of successful ambushes, successful observations, especially from pre-prepared positions and fortifications. It all increases that significantly compared to flat open terrain, where a state-style military with long-range systems, planes, choppers, does have more of an advantage. Close terrain absolutely helps those smaller forces. And it reduces significantly the primary advantage of these modern state militaries. Primarily, the thing I talked about when I was in the north, and you can go back through my videos, was the use of armour. That tracked vehicles can get over a lot, they're not getting through some of that, therefore light infantry is light infantry. It also then has an effect in steep mountainous terrain. Just watch Lone Survivor if you want a good example of this, that your fast air for observations and targeting due to that build-up is very difficult as well. Even your slow air, your rotary wings can be a problem. But as well, so the Lone Survivor thing's probably more for this, is a reduction in your radio effectiveness. Your radio communications will have blackouts, as well as the effectiveness of your electronic warfare, with, of course, the terrain having huge effect on this. As well, there is an effect back at the artillery lines. There is an effect on that because your having to then use more high trajectory weapon systems like mortars rather than a traditional, say, like M777 artillery gun like we've seen used a lot down in Gaza where it's very flat, and those mortars, of course, have a much shorter range. So this sort of terrain does level the battlefield a lot between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces. Where Israel have the technology and the equipment, that really gets drawn down by actually that being able to be brought into the fight in terrain such as this. And I would hazard a guess, as this is the Hezbollah will want to fight on will want to fight on terrain of their advantage and will be built up specifically in this areas of where you can't get this vehicle in, or it's going to be hard to get a bomb on X target. Now, what we've been told so far is that this will be a limited operation. That said, we heard the exact same thing about Gaza almost a year ago, and that of with the defeat Hamas, the limited operations, we thought that would be done by Christmas. And we're October the 3rd today, and of course that initial terror attack that went into Israel happened on October the 7th. And what we have seen since then, from that first limited operation to now, is complete worldwide outrage, the massive sowing of division, and tens of thousands of civilian deaths as well. Now, something that needs to be recognised in this is Hezbollah is significantly more powerful than Hamas. And Hezbollah has a far greater relationship with Iran. Now, Hamas is a Sunni Muslim terror group that is really a useful contractor for the Shia Muslim IRGC, where Hezbollah are also Shia Muslim, so therefore they are a fully fledged proxy ally of the IRGC. We know Russia has a lot of involvement into Iran, and you can see these steps of connection that I'm pulling together here as well, and how that division may help through proxy and then further proxy and or contractor. The enemy of my enemy is my friend in many ways. And this is very obvious if you want to get another example of how Hamas is much further away of an ally than Hezbollah is. Look at the retaliatory strikes we've had over the past 48 hours from Iran when Israel targeted the leadership of Hezbollah. Now, the defeat and winning. The defeat of these groups is almost impossible in a tactical military nature. The only way to really defeat these ideological groups like this is social changes in country, and that takes decades, if not centuries, if possible at all, if there's a willingness to actually do this. And this is the strength of a group like Hezbollah or Hamas, that these groups are driven by deeply rooted ideologies, whether it is religious, political, or ethnic, or sometimes just then hate. These ideologies, of course, then attract followers who believe they're part of a larger cause. And this makes the movement incredibly resilient. And then even if leaders are killed or captured, the ideas continue then to inspire others. And this leads to a regeneration of these groups and rise new factions. And this leads into a few things of people claiming the decapitation of these groups due to taking out senior leaders. Well, we took out a heap of senior leaders in Afghan between the coalition. That didn't have that much effect there. We'll speak on that. But also I speak of this regeneration of groups that I've stated before, and I stated this last year in Israel, that for every member of these groups killed, I believe 5 to 10 around, not only in these areas, but in other corners of the globe, 5 or 10 more are then further radicalised, and gives, of course, the fighting age males, it's far easier then to radicalise younger people, seeing, well, the bomb is dropping here, look at this. Have a look through countries in the West, look at Australia, people marching on the street with Hezbollah flags. Now, is that radicalised to the degree of doing an action? I don't know. But is there further support there? Absolutely. So this is where that can have then the negative effect. And this is why I state that I believe Israel will likely be tactically successful, like at winning X mission here. Yep, you'll win that. But strategically, at the end, to dismantle these groups and have this kumbaya sort of situation on the borders, I believe will very likely fail. And I believe in Gaza has already failed many months ago. Now, these groups and these organisations, whether they all engage in asymmetrical warfare, where they use guerrilla tactics, bombings, hit and run strategies, rather than like direct, decisive military engagements. And what this does is this allows them to avoid conventional confrontations. If you get into a direct conventional confrontation with the state military and you're one of these groups, you will lose. But they purposely don't get into this. You use other tactics. And what this does is this allows them to avoid these confrontations, and it makes it incredibly difficult for traditional military forces to actually neutralize them. And the somewhat decentralized structure of these groups makes it difficult to impossible in some cases to actually dismantle the entire organization with targeting senior leadership. It just seems like, well, someone is put in here, or that this group and this group's relation, yeah, you got the same name, same flag, but it can be difficult. Now, I say somewhat because Hezbollah has more centralized command than other groups around the world, but still to a degree, not the same as like a traditional military structure. And my example of this is, do you have any idea how many Taliban high-value targets the SAS killed in Afghanistan, only to be replaced very quickly and carried on like nothing then happened? And of course, we all know how that worked out for the coalition and 20 years of war. And now that group is bigger and more powerful than when we left. This gets into my next point. The track record for large states defeating guerrilla forces, militias, terrorists, freedom fighters, whichever lens you want to look through these groups historically around the world, the track record for this isn't great. It does not inspire much confidence in a strategic victory here. Now, Sebastian Junger, who is a fantastic author, I recommend you read Tribe before Freedom, but either way, is fantastic. And he has in this a really good piece just about the difficulties of states versus then these groups. The basics of asymmetric conflict readily scale up. Insurgents like the Montenegrins cannot hope to beat a large conventional military in open combat, so they don't even try. Instead, they do what small athletes do. They stay mobile, they avoid standing toe-to-toe and trading blows, and they strike only when they can get away. Conventional armies burn through more fuel, munitions, and food in the same way that large fighters burn through more oxygen. And even wealthy nations cannot afford to maintain that level of effort indefinitely. The logistics demands of modern mechanised army are so enormous that most of its resources go into simply sustaining itself. No more than 1/3 of its soldiers are directly engaged in combat, and usually far less. It is far, far less than that. It can be 10%, if that, sometimes more like 5%, with the then logistical support, administrative support behind it. Insurgents, on the other hand, are almost all engaged in combat, often including senior commanders. And they never have to win. They just have to keep not losing. This is a problem I think that Russia is going to have further in Ukraine, even if there is some ground territory concessions made. If there are groups there, when we know there are ideologically radical groups there, if they keep then these missions, that's going to be very, very difficult. Same the other way, if Russia can, like they did in Donetsk and Luhansk, then influence then groups there, that's going to be a big problem for Ukraine also. But here, you never have to win. They just have to keep not losing. It's exactly the T-man in Afghanistan. Air power is also of limited value against smaller forces. In fact, there is almost an inversion of ordinary military principles. The fewer enemy there are, the harder they are to kill, and less likely they are to be defeated. Again, we saw the campaigns that took place across Gaza, and they're still fighting every day there. A 1,000,000-man army can probably be destroyed faster than a 1,000-man insurgency because it's completely dependent on command hierarchy and resupply. Destroy those things and there is no army. Most insurgencies, on the other hand, are composed of semi-autonomous cells that are dependent on the society they live in. Again, like we have spoken about, this is some of the problems. You've got this semi-autonomous, decentralized structure and they're dependent on the society. If you want to get rid of these groups, it takes decades, potentially centuries, within to change the societal movement to stop people joining or being radicalized. Therefore, though, the insurgency dies out, but it dies out of when someone can't fight anymore and there's no one to come through, not dies out by being directly targeted. And of course, it says they depend on the society they live in, and targeting civilians is a war crime. So, of course, all just mixed in, and this is why that bombing campaign has killed so many people as well and caused all that division and horrific images that we have seen. It also turns the populace against the invaders and drives them into the arms of the insurgents. So if you are someone living in Gaza and there's bombs dropped, it doesn't matter if Hamas is under your home. You're looking at, that bloke dropped a bomb on my house. Bombers and attack aircraft can drop devastating munitions on the battlefield, but they are easy for insurgents to avoid and incredibly costly to operate. There does not seem to be enough jet fuel in the world to keep enough aircraft aloft to kill all the people who are willing to die fighting them. Air power alone has never broken an insurgency, and reliance on it could almost be considered a sign of strategic failure. So if we see that air power alone at some point is what's fighting, it has never defeated one of these insurgencies or one of these more malicious style terror groups. And if we see that, then we can see that things aren't going too well if it's completely becomes reliant on that, not ground operations like we've seen. So then we need to talk about the asymmetric warfare group, the AWG in the US, talking about the weight of which some of these soldiers are carrying, and even the elite high mobility units in the US military, soldiers are reduced to maneuver speeds of 1 to 2 miles an hour by the loads they're carrying. And yet they are fighting insurgents who can move several times as fast. The result is that Western troops struggle to corner and defeat even lightly armed insurgents. You hear about this all the time in Afghan if they just fucked off. The parallel between current-day Taliban force in Afghanistan and the Apache of the 1860s and 70s is so obvious that the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, has published a monograph on Indian wars. The failed subjugation attempts assisted the Apache to develop a warrior culture based on resistance and survival through tactical actions. After 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, the US found itself having to negotiate with an insurgency that lacked air power, tanks, heavy artillery, and sometimes even boots. Most of the time, not even boots. It was sneakers or fucking sometimes just sandals. A relatively small number of Taliban insurgents fought the most powerful militaries, I'll say, in the world, and brought them to a standstill. And a prior generation of Afghans did the same thing to the former Soviet Union. The Taliban represent an oppressive ideology that has almost no respect for human rights, same as a lot of this too. But many insurgencies are fighting for those rights. And if all insurgencies and uprisings were easily crushed, there would be no possibilities for political change or freedom. In the world, among other outcomes, the US would not exist. So what it's speaking about here is that if you were able to defeat any of this with unjustness in the world, you could never rise up. So this is then different here. But you can see too, we're talking about then influence in the community. This is one of the big things like the Taliban had, as well as many of the like the warlords. We went to this General Sharif warlord when I was there, and he wasn't a good guy. Everyone called him the Kabul Butcher, but he was the reason that the community around him had things like running water, had schools, had electricity. Now, it's easy for us to sit in Australia, America, or Europe and go, yeah, but that guy's a bad guy. But the other option is then you don't have any of that. You won't get those people on your side by taking him out and being like, look, we killed the bad guy, but your school's not going to work. That's one of the problems. And this is where these deep roots get into the communities too, from these groups also. Again, what I'm getting at is you have to change the whole culture and society if you want to get rid of these groups. It takes a lot of time, insane amounts of money, but it also takes a willingness that that's what is wanted also. However it is defined, freedom is due in part to the fact that powerful nations do not always win wars and powerful men do not always win fights. In fact, as often as not, they lose. So I guess you could talk about, if this book is talking about like what is freedom and what it's more meaning to, well, if you're in the Taliban, your freedom you see is kicking these guys out, as well as then you have resistance against then authoritarian states too, that can lead to the freedom of then individuals within those states. So really interesting book if you'd like to have a read. But I think that it's highly likely, unless there is total war in the Middle East, that this time next year we will see just a very similar situation of which we probably have today. Or maybe it's come to a standstill, but the situation will still exist. We'll have a lot more people dead. And what this leaves me asking is what actually is the clear, defined and realistic end goal here, given the nature of radicalisation of more people within these groups and in the community. And I think what we're likely to see is a goalpost shift again and again, like we then saw in Afghanistan, leading to billions and billions of dollars spent, years and years and many, many lives, both civilian and coalition, to then have a failure and a handback. Anyway, legends, have a fantastic day. Cheers for talking to me, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.